Mediation, the New Possibilities Hour. Our topic is cross-cultural negotiations as we see it. And we have two wonderful guests to speak to us today, two past presidents of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association. First, we have Cyndie Chang. Cyndie is the managing partner of the Los Angeles office of Duane Morris LLP. And in addition to being a past president of NAPABA, she is a past president of the Southern California Chinese Lawyers Association. George Chen, who is joining us from Phoenix, is a member of the firmwide international board of Bryan, Leighton, Paisner LLP. He's the leader of the intellectual property practice group in Phoenix and also a past president of NAPABA. This webinar is part of the Will Work for Food project. We're here to raise money for food banks. This overall project has been organized by Natalie Armstrong, and it's just a tremendous project. We've raised close to $35,000 for food banks so far, and we hope that you contribute to a food bank if you like what you see. There's no charge for this webinar. With that, we'll turn it over to our very distinguished guests, Cyndie and George. They'll let us know of food banks that are close to their hearts so that hopefully we will support those food banks, and we'll hear about cross-cultural negotiations as they see it. With that, Cyndie, George, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I guess I'll start. My name is George Chen. I'm speaking to you from Phoenix, Arizona. And excuse me, Jeff, Natalie, thank you for that introduction. We appreciate everyone who's attending today. With respect to food banks, my food bank recommendation here for those who are looking for an opportunity to donate, it's called St. Mary's Food Bank. St. Mary's Food Bank, their website is firstfoodbank.org. Firstfoodbank.org. They have a lot of very interactive programs for children, and they have been around in the Phoenix area for several decades, and they do a fantastic job within our community. So if you're looking for somewhere to donate, St. Mary's Food Bank at firstfoodbank.org. Cyndie?
Hi, everyone. Glad to have NAPABA sponsor this and also speak to Jeff Kachavan's group. And I know that we have a very diverse group of people on this call. For me, we have one next to my LA office, the Salvation Army. But please, thank you for participating. I'm happy to be on this call. And if you can, we encourage you to donate to the food bank that's special to your heart.
All right, great. Thanks, Cyndie. One sort of administrative thing we'd like to just let everyone know, although Cyndie and I have some prepared remarks here, we recognize that many of you probably have some questions, and so feel free to ask those questions during the presentation. We will have an opportunity formally at the end for discussion, but more than likely it will probably be more informative, more useful for you if we have more of a conversation as opposed to just a lecture. So if you have questions, feel free to ask those questions at any time. You can use the chat feature, I think, and Natalie, I think, is going to be moderating the questions. She's monitoring the chat questions that you submit. And when you do submit something, she will just interrupt us, or perhaps Jeff will. Somebody will interrupt us and ask the question, and we'll just answer it at that time. Otherwise, as we said, there will be some time structurally, formally at the end of our prepared remarks. So with that, let me turn it over to Cyndie.
So this is how we thought we'd lay out the rest of this program. So with this diverse group, we have some people who are from NAPABA and some people who come from the mediation background and who are in Jeff's network. And the first part of this segment to just really talk about Asian American issues. George and I are past NAPABA president. Talk about generally understanding, you want to call it like, Asian American perspective and cultural issues that are important to us. And then the second part, we really thought, how do you leverage that in negotiations? Is there any particular tools, if at all, when you approach what we call, quote, cross-cultural negotiations So we could talk about anecdotes, we could talk about ideas and strategies when you're in the context of negotiations. And negotiations can be in anything. It could be in, a discussion with you and your spouse, or it could be in mediation or some other ADR setting, or, in the boardroom. So with that, let's just, set this up, George, and I'll kick it to you.
So basically, one thing that we'll mention for Cyndie and I, as Jeff had explained, we are past presidents of NAPABA. For those who might not be familiar with NAPABA, it is a voluntary bar association, a voluntary organization for lawyers, a national voluntary organization for lawyers that focuses on legal issues that are relevant to the Asian community, the APA community. The organization, NAPABA, has represents the interests of over 50,000 Asian Pacific American lawyers and judges across the country, and the Bar Association has over 70 state and local affiliates that comprise its membership. And one quick thing, just so that, just to sort of give everyone a baseline, there are many different phrases that are used to describe the Asian community within this country. Some people refer to it as Asian American. Some people refer to it as Asian Pacific American, and other people refer to it as Asian Pacific Islander. And I thought it would be helpful just to explain a little bit of the differences between those terms, because some people within the Asian community in general do see a difference between that. So Asian American, some people use that as sort of a pan-Asian term to cover all countries and cultures within Asia. Other people see it more narrowly. Other people will see it as more traditional, what I'll call Eastern Asian, which would be, for example, China, Japan, North and South Korea, and so on, and would not include the other countries and other cultures within Asia. The term Asian Pacific American is intended to cover the traditional, let's say, Asian, more narrow description of Asian, as well as Pacific Islander. And Pacific Islanders would include countries that would basically be sort of between the continent of Asia and Australia. And so you have typically the smaller countries that are in smaller Southeast Asian type of countries that are over there. We also have South Asian, which would be more like India and Pakistan and some of those areas. So the term Asian Pacific American or Asian Pacific Islander is intended to be more encompassing because some people just don't consider Asian American to include all of those areas. But Cyndie and I think we may jump back and forth between those terms, but it's intended to be more pan-Asian, let's say, and not specifically focusing on any particular culture or country within Asia, unless we're specifically identifying that. So just wanted to sort of set that background, difference between Asian American, South Asian, Southeast Asian, Pacific Islander, and so on. Not to make things confusing, but just to let people know that there are what some people might consider nuances, but I would consider them important nuances, if that's how you wanted to characterize it. So with that, why don't we turn it over to a more general discussion of understanding some Asian Pacific American or Asian Pacific Islander stereotypes. Cyndie?
Stereotypes are stereotypes, right? So, with Asian Americans, we often face challenges of, being meek or humble or coy or bad drivers, this and that. And, we suffer too from what we call the model minority myth, is that especially in the legal setting where Asian Americans can be considered hard workers and, worker bees that are very smart and intelligent. The problem with that is it's a myth and not really understanding that we are a very diverse group. So, in the legal profession, especially for me in the law firm setting, I see that how that plays out is when one is, for example, advancing in from associate to partner and stuff, you often see that Asian Americans suffer from, being relied on to be the good worker bees, but when it comes to promotion and becoming a partner and being relied on for a book of business or being a lead on a case or being the ones that they're going to take to introduce the client occur at that point in time in the promotion level. And so you see numbers of larger amounts of Asian Americans in associate ranks and then seeing them drop off in numbers as you go higher in seniority to partner level rank. So I only bring that up because we are all mostly in the legal profession and thought that we could talk about some of that and how that might play out in the greater community. I did want to just give like a summary about just Asian Americans in general. Right now, in the times we're dealing with COVID, and we're this virus that we're having. There are references to Chinese virus, Kung flu, or the Wuhan virus, and I know that has come from the top levels of our government, and there's been some retraction of that, but it still continues. Let's talk a little bit about the brief history, briefly about some of the historic racism that has occurred against Asian Americans. And constantly we as Asian Americans, are dealt with as the perpetual foreigner. And regardless of, like, for example, my family's been here for over 5 generations, continuing to have comments about, go home to your, country, when, the only country I've been in is in the United States. Some of these things that are going on today, where we're really talking about racism, gives us reminders of our Asian American history, going back from, the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1800s. The entire national group was blocked from immigrating to our country. And we have, for example, xenophobia after 9/11, when there was, hatred against Muslims or South Asians. And let's not forget about during World War II, when we rounded up and incarcerated them in internment camps because of their Japanese ancestry. So, there's a lot of history. I think back to the 1980s. Vincent Chen was in Detroit, and in 1982 he was murdered and actually bludgeoned to death because he was blamed for putting auto workers out of a job. That really did spark an Asian American movement.
Great, thanks, Cyndie. I'll add one other thing. Cyndie, you mentioned the model minority myth, and this goes back to my earlier comments of really there's different segments of the Asian community in the United States, and the model minority myth, if you break it down, it really applies more to the traditional East Asian community, because those folks are historically, let's say, the first immigrant, and those folks are the ones who maybe have been here for let's say up to 5 or more generations, as Cyndie's family has been. And so those folks are we're referring more to the Chinese, Japanese, South Koreans, and so on. And it's not so much the model minority myth. If you look at the demographics, does not apply actually to other segments of the Asian Pacific American community, and in particular, let's say the newer immigrant communities, which generally are more on not the traditional East Asian communities, but rather some of the other communities that I had mentioned before. And the model minority myth, if you look at the demographics there, does not apply as much. And so there's a very, for lack of a better term, diverse population within the Asian community within the United States. So with that, we thought we would talk a little bit about Asian culture, or Asian Pacific Islander culture and communication, and how that would affect negotiation, mediation, and so on, because communication obviously is how we're going to conduct these negotiations. So I'll just at the outset mention 3 things. One is saving face, which I think most people are familiar with that concept. Second is humility, which Cyndie had mentioned earlier. And thirdly, I'll mention is contextual. Most Asian cultures, at least that I'm familiar with, are very contextual. And so let me go into that a little bit more. So saving face, I think most people are familiar with. It's about providing an out, right? Not requiring the other side to be embarrassed, to be publicly shamed, or anything like that. It's all about preserving the reputation of your family, of your parents, your grandparents, and so on. So I think that is probably fairly well understood, but if people have questions about that or want to talk about that further, Cyndie and I would be happy to do that. Secondly, I mentioned humility, and Cyndie had mentioned this earlier. And this includes things which are perhaps a little bit more subtle. They can be verbal cues, they can be nonverbal cues as well. They include things like it's actually disrespectful to look someone in the eye if they are your superior, right? So if you're meeting the CEO of a company, if you're the mediator and you're meeting the CEO, right, and it's somebody from Asia, right, who's very traditional Asian cultures, you should consider, you may want to look at them, but then, you want to look basically at their shirt or at their shoes or your own shoes. That is the sign of respect. It's very different, obviously, here in American culture. From a verbal cue standpoint, humility expresses itself in terms of, for example, if somebody asks you, can you do this? The more traditional Asian way of responding is to say, I'll try. Even though you know you can do it, and in fact, even though you know you've done it 1 million times, you will still say, I will try. And that's not to be interpreted as, I'm not sure if I can do it. Although some people who are looking at things on a more literal basis, they may interpret that to mean, I don't know if I can do it. Or in a negotiation context, if you ask someone, look, we would like this settlement term, they may say, I'll think about it. And my family, we joke about it when someone says, I'll think about it. That's what we call the Chinese no, right? Because they won't disagree with you to your face. They're indirect. And so that's another sort of contextual type of thing, to not disagree, because disagreeing could cause the other person to be embarrassed and lose face. And so culturally, you don't say no. But in a negotiation context, right, if someone's saying, I'll think about it, if they are really communicating in a more traditional Asian style, highly possible that they're really saying no. And so you shouldn't think of that as, well, maybe there's a chance, so I'll keep pushing on this, because you probably won't get anywhere. From a contextual standpoint, in addition to the, not saying no, it's actually, at least I'm not sure about other Asian cultures, but in Chinese culture, if somebody asks you a question, you could say, yes, I agree. But to say, yes, I agree, even more strongly, you would say, you are not wrong. So saying you are not wrong in Chinese is actually a stronger way of saying, yes, I agree, than saying directly, yes, I agree. And this is all about sort of the indirect way that many Chinese people, and I'm pretty sure many other Asian cultures will communicate. The last thing about context is, and this again is more focused on Chinese, but the concept of sarcasm does not exist in Chinese. And it's because Chinese is, no matter which dialect of Chinese you speak, it's spoken in single syllables. Like every word is a single syllable. There's no multi-syllabic word. And every single sound, every single syllable sound has 4 pitches or 4 tones. And each of those tones mean something different. So just as an example, ma, 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 ma. Those are 4 different words. Ma is your mother. Ma is like numb. Ma is a horse. And ma is to scold, right? The last thing you want to do is call your mom a horse. But in any event, because you have these different tones, you can't use tone to indicate sarcasm the way you do in the United States, right? In America in general, or in English in general. So just these different concepts of communication are important to understand when you're dealing with someone who is communicating in that style. And then the last point I'll just mention here is just because we look Asian, Cyndie and I look Asian, but as Cyndie said, she is 5th generation, right? Her family has been in the U.S. for 5 generations. My family has been in this country for only 3 generations. I'm 2nd generation. My parents immigrated over here in the United States. I was born here, and my children were born here. So I consider myself having more American culture values than Asian cultures, but I grew up, right, in a Chinese household, so I am very, very familiar with these Asian cultures. But just because someone looks like me doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be communicating in this way that I just explained, because they may be, 5th generation or more, or they may be able to easily adapt between 2 different cultures, American culture and Asian culture. So these communication styles, very different, and it can be very important in a negotiation context. So I think I went a little bit long there, but in any event, let me turn it back over to Cyndie for the next topic.
Start jumping into thoughts about negotiations and trying to understand the other side. But before we do that, I do want to take 1 minute, going back to what I was saying earlier about Asian Americans now in America, to talk about the racism that's been increasing, especially in this COVID environment where there has been, and it's been confirmed by the FBI, that there has been a rise in hate attacks against Asian Americans because of the flu being from an Asian country. And there's statistics that are showing that we all must remember that this virus does not discriminate. It in fact anyone globally. It's people that discriminate. So with that, and again, I remind the group, please let's have a conversation. Let's talk about different hypotheticals, and everyone else share experiences. That would be great to have questions posed. How I think about negotiations, the assumptions I make, and whoever's on the other side actually no assumptions. You just don't know. For example, let's just say look at the other side and George, and he's Chinese. If I had not known him, I wouldn't know, if his background was, Beijing, Shanghai, Taiwanese, or Korean, Japan, whatever, South Asian. And so I think that the first point, which is understanding your other side and listening, and I think that requires empathy. I've read, different kinds of negotiation books, and one, for example, where it tries to address cultural negotiations categorically and say, okay, if you're dealing with an American, these are, American stereotype, aggressive, they assume a zero-sum game, and so forth. Or if you're dealing with a Chinese, they could be sly and they may hide the ball. And so I think that perhaps that could be part of your tool set. But again, going back to what I was originally saying is that you just really have to understand there's so much complexity. For example, George and I may be alike in that we're both Chinese. I might have more affinity with him and be a better leverage tool. And where you come from is we might find out we came from the same locks, for example, and that might be the actual common denominator that brings us together. With that, I guess, I was also thinking about then try to understand the other side. And maybe it's not looking at them from a visual standpoint and trying to assign certain traits because of what nationality they come from or where they live, but it's actually looking at them from a human level. But actually, the book that I like the most is it's written by someone named Chris Voss, Never Split the Difference. And he talks about you need to look at the other side as human level. And, there are three categories basically of types of people and personality types. So one is the fight type, aggressive and I want to kill you kind of, assumption. The second is the flight type, someone who tends to escape and want to retreat. And the third is the more gregarious, accommodating type. And obviously people can have combinations of a mixture of either. And that might be a way to look at the other side, look at them from personality type. George and I were talking about, okay, let's talk about situations of, if your adversary is diverse or Asian American, or when your neutral is diverse or American, or when your client is Asian American or diverse, and what have we learned from that, and what can we share? So, does someone have a question?
Yes, there is a question. The question being posed is, does the cultural context George discussed inhibit the Asian American community from speaking out against racism, potentially leaving the erroneous impression of tacit agreement or permission to continue?
I guess I'll respond first, and you may have some other thoughts as well. I think culturally it does, and part of this is I think if you look at many of the Asian cultures and sort of look at what environment those people are living in within Asia, many of the governments over in these Asian countries, there are certainly exceptions, but many of the governments, including China, are very, they have a lot of control. And some might consider them to be very heavy-handed in how they rule the country. And so, because of that, many people in these Asian countries will grow up trying to just stay low. Right? There's an expression in Chinese that says, "The nail that sticks up gets hammered," right? So basically, culturally, you don't want to necessarily stand out. because there could be bad consequences. And then similarly, to respond to the question, you may not want to speak up because that makes you stand out. And so, that's also part of the humility sort of culture. And again, very, very different within the U.S. And so I think there have been, there is a change now as we have more, let's say, as Asian Pacific Islanders are living in the U.S. for more and more generations, they become, let's say, more American. They're embracing more American values and are speaking up more so. I'll say that I think the Asian American community has, from that perspective, has benefited from the African American or Black community within the United States. The Vincent Chen incident in the 1980s up in Detroit that Cyndie had mentioned, Chinese person who was assumed to be Japanese and was bludgeoned to death for supposedly putting all the American auto workers out of jobs. That situation, at least as far as I'm aware, was one of the first where the African American community basically assisted and stood up for the Asian American community with protests, because the two individuals who had bludgeoned to death Mr. Chen were not convicted. And so it was actually the African American community, the Black community that had come to rally support for the Asian American community. And so there have been, since then, I think there has been a sort of a growing movement, I'll say, where Asian civil rights are becoming more, Asians are becoming more vocal, let's say, about their civil rights. Cyndie, additional thoughts?
Yeah. And, two areas that are really important that I can think of is one is in voting. So, and the second is in the census. So, with regard to this concept of, are Asian Americans active enough and engaged and speaking out and making their voice heard with respect to voting, I think there have been political groups that may not think that the Asian American vote is significant enough to really talk to our communities and really engage, because we don't have or we don't wield as much influence at the ballot box. And George has indicated we're working on that to increase voter engagement and maybe culturally where going to vote and you being of immigrant roots and not really thinking that come from some other country or whatnot, or not really assimilating. Certainly a lot of work, especially NAPAB and, and other related organizations in making sure that we are heard. And there are a lot more accomplishments over the last few years of Asian Americans also in high levels of politics. And the second is the census, which has just occurred recently. There was concerns as to immigrant communities being so scared that if they go and actually register to have their voice heard, there might be, whatever backlash against them and their community being deported or so forth. That's, actually contrary or counterintuitive in that, no, us as Asian Americans, we do need to be counted, because that's exactly how you allocate funds to the communities of color. So cultural passivity has been a challenge, but certainly not something that is not improving and that we need to be continually vigilant about.
All right, great. Hopefully that answers the question. And if there's follow-up with that, please certainly let us know. Cyndie, did you want to go back to what you were talking about previously?
We were just going to talk about different, situations. I have some clients that are, Asian American, and I have some clients that are, Asia. And certainly I've, learned, obviously there's the very obvious differences of like language differences. And I find that respect is actually the best tool that I've found, that learning and understanding the other side. Often I listen more than I talk, and I think that really does break down barriers in terms of letting the other side be heard. When my client is from Asia, I do realize fee setting, arrangement of fees. I know some of my Asian clients prefer to have more certainty. they might not understand the American like hourly rate system at firms and what cap fees arrangements. I think more often than not, I have clients that ask for capped fee arrangements or in their budgeting. And if you're a litigator like myself, that's very hard to predict and hard to work with. But having, Asian clients and having, Asian offices, we try to really understand those cultural needs and try to work out alternative fees. Oh, George, do you have any thoughts on that? Your clients being Asian American?
Yeah, with clients, I think again, it depends sort of how American they are, right? I mean, if they're really traditional Asian from Asia, don't have too much exposure to the American culture, there are just things that are different. And as I was explaining earlier during the seminar, things you have to be aware of. I'll give one example where, and it was my fault in this case because I did not prepare my client sufficiently, because I thought, right, I made a stereotype of my own client who was Asian. I thought my client was more American than he really was. And so when we were in this settlement negotiation, the other side had proposed a particular settlement term, and my client basically said, "Oh, I'll think about it." And I, so then afterwards, right, I asked my client, I said, "Well, does that mean no?" And he was even just like, "Well, it means I'm thinking about it. I'm not really sure." But I could tell from his response that he really wasn't that interested in it. But as the settlement continued over the next, several weeks, sporadically, the other side, apparently that particular settlement term was very, very important to them, very critical. And so they kept pushing on it because it was important to them. And they had heard directly from my client, directly from my client saying that he would consider it, when in fact he really wasn't considering, right? And so we had to just overcome that communication issue to ultimately reach a settlement that everyone, that all the parties agreed to. So I think certainly, and so I learned from that experience that, not to make my own assumptions of my own Asian clients as to sort of what communication style, how American, how Asian their communication style might be. Cyndie, you had a story, I think, when we were preparing for this seminar, you had a story about selecting a neutral in a very, I think, unique situation. You want to share that with the group?
Oh yeah, thank you for reminding. Yeah, so I'm leading a litigation team, and it just so happens that everyone in my team are Asian American female litigators. There's 3 of us, and it just worked out. It was the right people for the team, the skill set, the capacity, and so forth. And it's in arbitration, and we, on the law firm front, we're trying to make teams more diverse, and in this case, we had a very diverse team. And we brought it up as a group and said, is this going to help us or hinder us in the best services for our clients, because we're all Asian American females, and how will that affect any impressions that we have with our neutral? And we really, at the outset, kind of put that at top of mind. And one would think, why? This is the people that have the right substantive skill set. But it is, certainly coming from a minority female perspective is something that, you have to think about, because when you walk into a room and you're representing your client's interests, you don't want that to be the distraction in the substance of what you're advocating for. We really did do a deep dive on all the neutrals selected to see, and maybe even made some of our own assumptions based on what you can get, like, looking at bios and videos and articles and getting feedback, and had to extensively interview people and say, do you think he'd be open, or do you think you would have some unconscious bias against us because Asian Americans may, I know for me, like, they think I'm young, they think that I'm petite, or whatever, and I might not be the commanding white male presence that one may stereotypically think of as the head of a litigation team. But very important to us to do our prep work, and we looked at bios of neutrals to say, okay, what is it in their bio that might make them maybe more open to us? Do they've got, international practice? What kinds of matters have they handled? What areas of government or where have they practiced, or were they prosecutors, were they this, what side? I mean, we really did some trying to do some psychoanalysis, and whether it's right or wrong, it's just trying to get information. We looked at their bar associations, what organizations they were in, do those organizations embrace diversity inclusion. So it was just interesting, and certainly something to think and consider, especially if you're coming from a minority background when selecting a neutral. George, did you have any anecdotes you wanted to share?
Yes, actually I do, but I noticed, just kind of peeking at the clock here, we've got a little bit over 10 minutes left in this seminar. We want to respect everyone's time, so we do want to end at the top of the hour. So that's, Cyndie and I have more or less completed our prepared remarks. So if folks have questions, feel free to please use the chat function. If we're a little bit more shy of a group, I've got some stories, and Cyndie, I'm sure, has more stories that she can share as well with respect to negotiations, perhaps mediations, arbitrations, and so on, with respect to Asian American issues.
Yes, it says, can you share what are some challenges you personally faced along the way as an Asian American associate to making partner at your respective law firms, and how did you overcome those challenges?
Okay. Cyndie, you want to respond first?
Yeah, sure. It's been challenging from day one to today. And I continue to say that as an Asian American female, and it's why I continue to advocate on behalf of Asian American women in the law. I just felt that, despite my success, I continue to, from day one, try to overcome cultural stereotypes. So I've shared the story with some of my NAPABA colleagues, but even when I was a first year associate, I almost left the practice of law because I was at a small firm. I was the only Asian American female. I was a cog in the wheel, and definitely worked hard. But I was told by the partner who was at the head of the letterhead that I would never become a trial lawyer because I was, too meek and not aggressive enough. And certainly that lit a fire under me to eventually become a partner. And I continue to have cases where it's either other opposing counsel, or it's judges, or it could be anyone from the bailiff that will just make assumptions about me if I'm the secretary or the court reporter. Or some cases, I've had opposing counsel say very uh, you know uh, dismissive terms about me. And it's been a struggle, and now even when I'm managing partner, I still face challenges in trying to um, have my voice heard on, for example, I'm on our partners board. I'm one of the few um, minority females on the board. I was the first, and now we have others. And it's intimidating in that you're one of just a handful, or if not the only, in a group of predominantly white and male settings, and you sometimes question whether am I a token here, or am I really heard? And when you have decisions made about you that are perhaps not favorable, you have to always think to yourself, okay, is it because of this reason, or is it because you may have some unconscious bias against me? And so I think it's been a struggle from day one to today. And I we're a resilient group, and we continue to try to be eyes wide open, and trying to figure out, how can I learn from this, and how can I overcome it? George?
So sure, I'll share some things as well. It certainly has been a challenge, I'll say. For me in my Phoenix office, when I joined, there's not a lot of Asians in Arizona in general, and so there's not that many Asian lawyers in my Phoenix office. Although now, in an unusual set of circumstances, I'm a partner in our Phoenix office. I'm on the international board of my firm, one of 15. For a while, I was the first and only Asian American on our board, and we now have 2, which is fantastic. But in our Phoenix office, our office managing partner also happens to be Asian as well. So the situation is very different now than when I joined the firm 20 years ago or so. But some of the challenges that I face, I think, are pretty typical in terms of people just sort of making having certain initial impressions about who you are, what you're capable of, and what you'd be best suited for in terms of job assignments. And for me, it was more about, just making my, just talking to the partners, talking to the senior associates who are assigning the work and letting them know, look, I've been doing this for a while. I feel like I've, come a long way, come up on the learning curve. I'd like to do something, I'd like to do this other thing, and just asking, making my desires known. I always tell associates now that, look, the best person to look out for your career is you. And you need to figure out, if I want to make partner here at this firm, what are the requirements? What are the accomplishments of recent partners? And sort of you can pattern it after that. Have some open, honest conversations with partners to ask, are you really on track? Just because nobody says anything, no news doesn't necessarily mean good news in this context. So, those types of things. Like Cyndie, I'm also a litigator, but my practice is more on the intellectual property side, exclusively on the intellectual property side. But I also have an intellectual property transactional practice, helping clients obtain patents, trademarks, and things like that, in addition to litigating them. But in a litigation context, even I'm 50 now, right? And I still have this situation where opposing counsel, they're not familiar with me, may assume that I'm going to be meek, I'm going to be quiet, I'm not going to object. And so many times I will have to, I will let them know up front and early that I will object. I may object, frankly, more than I should, but just to let them know that I'm not going to sit here and be quiet. If it's not on videotape, I may shout at the opposing counsel initially, just to get the point across. Don't make these assumptions about me, because I just want to start off on the right foot. I have a story where I think I was a 4th year associate at the time, and this very influential rainmaker had decided that he wanted me to handle this copyright case for one of his smaller clients. And it was a 3-party. It ended up being a 3-party mediation, and I was the only. There were 9 people there at the mediation. 3 sets of lawyers, 3 sets of clients, and the mediator. And I was the only, frankly, non-Caucasian person in the room or in the rooms. There was a time when the mediator brought us all into the same room, and apparently, the other 2 parties had reached some sort of tentative agreement and just said, well, George's client could just pay the difference to the plaintiff, and we'll just be okay with it. And so as we're all in this room, I could tell like everyone was kind of ganging up on me and my client, and my client was more elderly. And so she didn't say a whole lot. So once I realized, that they were trying to just, they had already, at least from my perception, had already kind of agreed this is what's going to happen, and George's client's going to pay the difference, and we'll be done. I basically first was very polite and said, look, this is not rational. My client, frankly, shouldn't even be here. We told you this from the beginning, reasons 1, 2, and 3. It's in our mediation briefs, blah, blah, blah. And they just kept insisting and just completely ignoring what I was saying. So finally, I basically threw a fit, right? It's like 1 a.m. in the morning, right? We're still in this room. And I basically pounded on the table, and I stood up and I pointed at every single person, and I said, you are not listening. We are not paying. And, if we're going to go to trial, let's go. And then I told my client we're leaving. So, well, we didn't leave. We just, went into our separate room. And then, my client was very nervous. Said, "Are you sure that's the right approach?" I said, "Just let's see." We came in, mediator came in and said, "Okay, they've agreed. Your client's not paying anything." So, I mean, it was just one of those things where I really think that they had thought that, well, here's this young guy, right? He looks like he's 15. And he probably doesn't have much experience. Well, they probably saw my bio, right? I was 5 years out of law school. And so we could probably take advantage of the situation. And because, I'm Asian and so on and so forth. And there's just times when you have to, at least in my experience, just do the complete opposite and maybe go a little overboard to make sure that the other side doesn't miss the point. So anyway, let's see here. I think we're doing okay we're almost out of time, actually.
Yeah, we have a little less than 5 minutes left. So if you two would like to make some concluding remarks, I think that would be great.
All right. Cyndie, would you like to start us off?
Sure. My couple points I'll just remember. Those of us who are very well versed in the diversity and inclusion space, understand how important that is, and that there are studies and statistics that confirm that diversity on your teams is so important and leads to better results and better decisions. We live our life experiences and we deal with different kinds of situations. We understand, Asian American backgrounds and the diaspora and cultural difference and so forth. But you do have this large tool set to inform your ultimate assessment of who you're dealing with. But you start with listening, you start with empathy, and you do some preparation, and then you go to your toolkit to help you inform yourself on how you approach whatever situation you're dealing with. And if you've got Asian American colleagues and you're in the pandemic, please check in on them. See xenophobia or so forth, please denounce that in the way that you think is appropriate for that particular situation. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. George, please.
Great. Yeah, I'll be very quick here. I think we're just about out of time. I agree with everything that Cyndie said. I think listening and empathy and just being being a good supporter, regardless of whether you're Asian American or Asian Pacific Islander or not. Just being supportive of the issues that our communities are facing. The other thing I will say is that seminars like this, and you can read books, you can there's a bunch of YouTube videos on these kind of cultural differences, and certainly many articles published on the internet about the same topic. But I will say there is no substitute, right, for actually experiencing it. There is no substitute, and just reading about it, hearing about it is good, but there's no substitute for actually experiencing it. And so I would encourage those of you who are attending this seminar who maybe don't have much experience with people of Asian or Asian Pacific Islander descent to go and experience it. Whether that once this pandemic is over, taking someone out to lunch and just finding out about their experiences. What was it like growing up? And I think that will give you a much better appreciation for how to communicate and how Asians who are more Asian than American would be communicating as well. So I would encourage you to go out and experience that as well. So Jeff, turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Natalie, we have one slide. Our speakers have provided us with their contact information. So if people would like to follow up with any questions, Cyndie and George have very graciously made their contact information available for people. Let's wrap up by saying thank you, first of all, to Cyndie Chang and George Chen for an excellent presentation this morning, to the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, NAPABA, for being the co-sponsor of this seminar and helping us raise a record number of people attending. Natalie, thanks to you for organizing the Will Work for Food project. at about $35,000 raised for food banks. George had mentioned firstfoodbank.org in Phoenix, Arizona. Cyndie had mentioned the Salvation Army. Please support those food banks if you wish, or any food bank. They all do a wonderful job of helping to fight food insecurity. And with that, Natalie, back to you.
Jeff, thanks so much. George, Cyndie, really powerful presentation, greatly appreciated. I would just like to add one thing, to encourage Americans to get a passport and use it. One of the best ways that you can be involved, be tolerant, be empathetic is to experience any number of cultures for yourself personally, face-to-face. Appreciate their music, appreciate other cultures, appreciate other foods, appreciate other histories. So get a passport.
Thanks, everybody.